Welcome to Nature Revisited, a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. My name is Stefan Van Noorden, and thank you, everyone, for joining me. On today's episode, we are joined by Ben Goldfarb, author of the new book, Crossings. Ben Goldfarb is a conservation journalist and the author of the best-selling book, Eager: The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. In his new book, Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, Ben addresses the crisis of how roads and cars have transformed our planet and how road ecology is trying to change that trend with innovative solutions. Crossings has been named one of the best books of 2023 by the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Smithsonian, and Science News. Ben joins me from his home in Colorado. So Ben, welcome to Nature Revisited. It's a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
In your new book, Crossings, you address two very important issues. First, road ecology, which most of us are not really aware of, and roads, which most of us don't even think about. But first, let's start with when did you first start thinking about writing this book and why?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really goes back to the fall of 2013. At the time, I was in Montana. I was traveling around writing about habitat connectivity and fragmentation, the idea that animals, especially big animals like the ones that live in the northern Rockies, grizzly bears and elk and wolverines and wolves, these are critters that walk across large landscapes and really need access to these huge areas of habitat to find food and shelter and mates and all of the things that all organisms need. Roads and towns and other human infrastructure get in the way of that. And so I was learning about this problem of habitat fragmentation, but I also had the chance to check out some of the solutions in the form of these wildlife crossings on Highway 93 north of Missoula that I got to take a tour of. And these were these mostly underpasses, but one large overpass as well, tunnels and bridges that animals can use to safely cross this potentially dangerous highway. And these crossings had been built on the Flathead Reservation, the land of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. So I had a chance to take a tour of these wildlife crossings, and I got up on top of one of these wildlife overpasses, and it was just kind of incredible moment. I think I realized that we do so much on this planet to make animals' lives harder and more dangerous. And here was this incredible, beautiful piece of infrastructure we built to make their lives a little bit safer and easier. And I found that really inspiring. And I was also fascinated by the intellectual challenge of wildlife crossings. How do you create a bridge or a tunnel that's enticing to a bear or a moose or a bobcat or a meadow vole? The whole spectrum of animals that need to cross these highways safely. So it was really that experience in 2013, checking out those wildlife crossings that got me so excited about this topic.
So what is road ecology, and what is some of its history?
Road ecology is really this big and fast-growing field of science that looks at all of the different ways that road and nature interact, mostly negatively. And that's everything from roadkill, of course, the dead animal by the side of the highway, to this barrier effect, this kind of steady wall of traffic on so many major highways are preventing animals from moving around the landscape and completing their migration, to the impact of noise pollution on songbirds and road salt, which is affecting freshwater ecosystems all over the country. So road ecology is a big field of science that looks at all of these different issues and looks at how we start to redress or solve some of those issues through solutions like wildlife crossings or road decommissioning, the removal of certain roads potentially. This idea of road ecology, it really goes back 100 years to the kind of the proliferation of the automobile in the early 1900s. There were lots of biologists driving around places like Iowa and Illinois and saying, wow, look at all of these dead ground squirrels and garter snakes and woodpeckers. This new technology, the car, is really problematic. So, you can read road ecology papers that are a century old, even though they wouldn't have called it road ecology. And the term itself is a little more recent. That dates to the 1990s. But a landscape ecologist named Richard Foreman at Harvard, he coined that idea of road ecology in the 90s. So it's this field with a long history, but that has really rapidly changed and evolved and become more vibrant in recent years as we recognize just how deleterious roads really are for nature.
So just how pervasive is the death of animals and other species caused by cars driving on roads?
The short answer is we don't totally know. Some number of states keep track of large animal collisions and deaths, animals like deer and moose and elk. Certainly very few are monitoring lizard deaths and snake deaths and turtle deaths and songbirds. It's an enormous problem, one that we don't totally understand. But, what we can say confidently is that more than 1 million animals, vertebrate animals, are killed by cars every day in the U.S. Roadkill is the leading cause of mortality for wild animals in the United States. There's literally nothing that we do that kills more animals than drive. I think in large part because the animals we tend to see most often by the side of the road are, logically enough, most common ones like gray squirrels and raccoons and white-tailed deer. We have this way of dismissing roadkill as a true conservation problem. Yeah, we're killing lots of raccoons, but there are lots of raccoons out there, so, what's the big deal? But, there are also dozens of threatened and endangered species like Florida panthers and ocelots and tiger salamanders and key deer, for which roadkill is the leading cause of mortality and absolutely an existential threat that's literally driving many of these species toward extinction.
But it's not just roadkill that affects animals and wildlife. It's the road itself. Can you talk about the relationship between animal migration and movement and roads and highways? What some call landscape dissection and the incredible effect it has, such as LA's 101 and the mountain lions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a good case study that illustrates the scale and scope of the problem. There's this little population of mountain lions who live in the Santa Monica Mountains west of Los Angeles. They're surrounded by these giant freeways, the 101 and 405, and these are some of the busiest freeways on Earth. Kind of incredible that these cats have survived for as long as they have. The problem is that they're stuck on an island. They're in this little island of wildness in the Santa Monica Mountains, surrounded by this ocean of freeways. So as a result, they really can't burst out of the population. Young male mountain lions, especially after their cub phase, go out and find their own territory. They can't really do that because they can't get off the island and cross highways. Some end up being killed by older mountain lions because they just can't find their own safe place to live. But, in some ways, even the bigger problem is that no new mountain lions can enter the island. And so as a result, those cats are stuck mating with their own relatives. There are no unrelated cats coming in. As a result, they're very inbred, what scientists have called this extinction vortex. But, fortunately, there's a solution, which is this big wildlife overpass at a spot called Liberty Canyon that's being built right now. It'll be the largest wildlife overpass in the U.S., and it will connect these mountain lions with cats elsewhere in California so they can go meet and mingle and breed and begin to heal some of those genetic divides that the freeway has created.
So what are some of these wildlife overpasses and ecoducts and landscape connections? And what does it mean for these wildlife crossings to work?
Yeah, it's a great question. As for what they are, the ones that probably most people are familiar with are those overpasses, bridges that arc over highways. There are also lots of other structures out there, far more underpasses than overpasses. There are toad tunnels, these salamander tunnels, these turtle culverts. In many tropical countries, you'll see rope ladders that connect fragments of forest over highways and get used by monkeys and sloths and all kinds of critters. So, really a wildlife crossing is just any kind of structure that's presenting animals from one side of the highway to another. And your question about what makes them work is a really good and important one, because it's one that, road ecologists are grappling with now in a lot of ways. Certainly these structures reduce roadkill dramatically. And typically, we see wildlife crossings paired with fences that run along the roadside and kind of funnel the animals or guide them to the crossings. And so that combination of crossings and fences typically reduces collisions by, more than 90%. These wildlife crossings are really effective. We know from studies that they're good at sort of reducing the genetic fragmentation I was talking about earlier, that animals go back and forth successfully and, they'll mate on either side of the highway. But the big question, I think, is what is the kind of the population level impact of all of those benefits? Now, can we just document a population of animals that's increased its numbers or its health because of a wildlife crossing?
How are amphibians and insects affected differently than mammals? And how do their numbers compare?
Amphibians are really an interesting one. They have to migrate in their own way. They're not moving hundreds of miles like a mountain lion is, but they're making these little seasonal movements, especially on those warm, wet nights in spring where they're waking up from hibernation and they're going to their little breeding ponds to reproduce. And they're so focused on reproduction that they'll just cross any road that's in their path. And the problem is that lots of roads tend to be in their path. What we see throughout the American Northeast and really all over the world are these just enormous killings of amphibians where you'll get, again, one of those big, warm, wet spring nights where they're all migrating at once and, they're just crossing any road in their path, and hundreds and thousands in some cases will just be killed in an evening. That roadkill problem is especially acute for amphibians. They're a little bit different in that way than a lot of mammals, right? Because mammals, they're a little bit more road savvy. I don't want to say that they're smarter, but, they're sort of they just kind of have a better understanding of what a road is and cars are. And so, animals like mountain lions and grizzly bears and wolves, these are animals who will sort of avoid traffic. Some critters like coyotes are really good at crossing roads and have a pretty good understanding of what a car is and are good at avoiding them. Whereas, again, those amphibians are just blindly marching forward and they get killed in enormous numbers. We haven't really done a lot for them. We've built lots of wildlife crossings in this country for large animals like deer and elk. These are animals that really endanger driver safety. Nobody wants to hit a deer. Hundreds of drivers are killed in large animal crashes every year. And, we've done a lot to prevent those large animal crashes, but we haven't done nearly as much to prevent the flattenings of leopard frogs and tiger salamanders and spotted salamanders and all of these other smaller amphibians. So we need to think a lot more, I think, about those amphibians.
In the book, you brought up the issue of forest roads and the Forest Service and how a road is never really a road.
Unbeknownst to most people, the single largest road manager on Earth is actually the U.S. Forest Service. This agency manages close to 200 million acres of public land and has something like 370,000 miles of road running through those public lands. These are mostly old logging roads. Well, they're still out there. It's really just incredible just how many old dirt logging roads are on the landscape. Big green blocks of wilderness that actually have higher road densities than New York City. And, those logging roads don't get a lot of traffic. They have big ecological impacts. Again, these are really low traffic roads, they're having outsized impacts on nature. To your question about how a road is never just a road, which I write in the book, that these roads have, they have a lot of symbolic importance to people. A lot of us love getting outdoors and recreating, right? I live in Colorado, and I use all of these old logging roads to access trailheads and fishing holes and campsites and all kinds of things. I drive on old Forest Service roads all the time. Lots of people do. Even though we know that it's good to remove some of these roads for the sake of nature, anytime you talk about removing roads, there are people who say, hey, these roads are birthright in some sense. It's my right as an American to, access our public land. By removing roads, you're in some sense infringing on those rights. And so that's the kind of the symbolic power of roads, is that they're not just how we move around, they're also how we, think about the landscape in a sense. They're these symbols of human access and dominion and privilege. And, anytime you talk about removing them, somebody's going to be upset about that.
So America is not the only country that loves building roads. In fact, globally, you point out other countries are building roads and infrastructure faster than any other time in history. How are different countries with different animals using road ecology to help? Countries like Brazil.
Brazil is really a great case study in a lot of ways. A country with a fairly large road network, a country that's building roads really rapidly. Lots of new roads are being created to service agricultural markets. And it's a place with incredible biodiversity, the most biodiverse country in the world. And it's full of all kinds of incredible animals like giant anteaters and maned wolves, golden lion tamarins, and all kinds of incredible critters that are really seriously affected by this increase in road construction. Fortunately, there's big road ecology movement there. There are lots of scientists in Brazil who are working on this issue of growing construction boom impact nature. Here in the U.S., we kind of built our infrastructure before we knew just how harmful it was to nature. We constructed all of these interstate highways and only realized later that they were destroying ecosystems, whereas Brazil is doing a lot of this work with the knowledge of our mistakes here in North America. So they can, in some cases, do it right. They're including underpasses and overpasses and fences and other innovative features in a lot of their construction. One of the cool places that I visited when I went to Brazil was this state park outside of Sao Paulo, where they had actually built a road through this park that was deliberately had lots of hairpin turns and was also kind of rolling up and down on the y-axis like a little roller coaster. And it was all to just slow driver speed and make it harder to drive fast for the sake of preventing animal collisions. That's kind of a pretty radical solution, certainly more radical than anything we've done in the U.S. Not to say that Brazil is perfect by any means. There are lots of ill-advised roads being built or paved through the Amazon right now. At least in some cases, they're doing some pretty creative stuff.
So let's visit Australia and how its roads and roadkill is different. Who are joys and what are cares?
Good question. This is one of my favorite chapters of the book. One of the places I went was Tasmania, that has the highest roadkill rates in the world. That's for a variety of reasons. Lots of animals there. The roads are kind of windy and go right through the bush without any kind of shoulders in many cases. So it's, sort of dangerous. And these animals are possums and wallabies and wombats. They're all marsupials. Of course, the famous key thing about marsupials is that they have a pouch. The females have this little maternal pouch, and they carry their babies, their joeys, around in that pouch as they develop. The really sad thing that happens in Australia, these female marsupials will be killed by cars, but their babies, their joeys, will actually survive in the pouch. And so there are hundreds of wildlife rescuers in Tasmania who go around checking the pouches of dead marsupials and then extracting those baby wombats or wallabies and then raising them to adulthood. Those people are called carers, which I think is just a beautiful word. And caring can be I don't have a full-time job. Some of these carers I talked to had many animals, a dozen in some cases, that just required constant attention. Kind of a huge sacrifice. The baby wombat can take 2 years to raise to adulthood. A very long-term commitment. So it's a big commitment, but it's also a really inspiring phenomenon, I think. One of the things that I just loved about it is that here in the U.S., I think we have this tendency toward roadkill blindness. We sort of look away from the dead deer or the raccoon or the possum. There's just so many of them, and they're kind of gruesome, and they just remind us of our own complicity in destroying nature. So we look away from these animals. In Australia and in Tasmania especially, all of these people who actually seek out roadkill and pay attention to it and try to repair some of the damage by raising the animals who were orphaned by it. Just found that an incredibly beautiful idea that people seek roadkill out and try to make reparations.
In the book, you also touch on the idea of anthropause, which is kind of the outcome of COVID. What is anthropause, and how has it changed things?
Spring of 2020, when we basically all stopped driving. COVID hit, all the businesses closed, and we're all kind of locked down at home. And obviously that was this enormous human catastrophe. But, it also came with real benefits for wild animals. Once all these humans aren't driving around, roadkill rate really declined. Animals were able to use new areas of habitat. One of the really cool scientific papers that was published after that basically showed that white-crowned sparrows, these great little songbirds, were able to sing sort of richer, more complex songs because they weren't just screaming over the noise of traffic. So there are all of these kinds of benefits from the anthropause, this period of human slowing down. Now, granted, those benefits were short-lived. By summer of 2020, we were driving around again. Roadkill was on the rise. In fact, there's evidence that animals might have been more susceptible to roadkill after traffic returned because they had kind of gotten acclimated to traffic-free landscape. Maybe the animals were using roads more frequently or grazing along roadsides and thus became more susceptible to collisions. Again, the benefits to wildlife were very short-lived, but, they were definitely real in that spring. To me, and what that tells us is that, yes, we've kind of taken over the world as humans, but, there's still plenty of wildlife that remains. And, those animals are just waiting for us to reduce our human footprint, kind of waiting in the wings, ready to retake the landscape in some cases. We'd never wish COVID again, but I think that there are lessons we can learn from it. You can imagine a situation where we learn to close roads more frequently during kind of critical migration periods for amphibians, or maybe we dramatically reduce the number of private vehicles that we allow in national parks because we know now the benefits of reducing traffic. That if we reduce our traffic and our vehicular footprint, animals can really benefit. It would be lovely to see us do that in a controlled, thoughtful way.
So lastly, do you see a light at the end of the road?
I kind of go back and forth between feeling hopeful and pessimistic about kind of the future of roads and nature. I think that what makes me feel pessimistic first is just the scale of the problem and the rapidly growing scale of the problem. We know that we're in this period that the ecologist Bill Lawrence calls the infrastructure tsunami. Wave of new construction that's sweeping over the planet with immensely negative effect on biodiversity. As I said at the start of this conversation, there's literally nothing that we do that kills more animals than drive or more wild animals. Now we're kind of exporting that American automotive model to places like Myanmar and Kenya and Nepal, places that haven't had a lot of traffic historically are now kind of following our lead and building highways really rapidly. In that sense, I definitely feel extremely concerned about the future of this issue. On the flip side, what makes me feel hopeful is just the rapidly growing scale and implementation of the solution. We know that there are just so many smart, thoughtful people who are working on this problem and pushing for more wildlife crossings and other solutions. Lots of state transportation departments, which historically really didn't think much about this issue are now incorporating wildlife crossings in kind of the normal course of events. This idea of helping animals cross highways safely, which was once this very fringe idea implemented in very few places, is rapidly becoming mainstream. That gives me some hope that conservation groups and scientists and government agencies are working on this problem and taking it really seriously. So there are days I wake up and I feel really positive about the future, and days that I wake up and feel a little bit despairing, and probably most environmentally conscious people feel the same way. I mean, my goal in writing the book was not to make anybody feel bad about driving necessarily. I drive all the time, and I've hit animals, and, I feel terrible about it, but I don't think that the answer to these problems is shaming individual drivers about their driving habits. I think it's really about changing our infrastructure, building those fences and wildlife crossings, and removing old Forest Service roads that are causing harm, and even tearing down urban freeways in some cities. It's sort of like climate change. The answer isn't necessarily to all go home and change our light bulbs. It's to change our infrastructure and political systems to create a less carbonized world. I think that road ecology tells us the same thing, that the solutions are large scale and infrastructural rather than individual and behavioral. Because look, if your goal is just shame Americans into driving less, that's not likely to work. Certainly my hope is that people look at their own cars and movements through the world in a different way. But I also don't want to make anybody feel personally ashamed, because in a sense we're all part of the problem, and we're also all part of the solution, hopefully.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Ben Goldfarb, and that you take the opportunity to read this fascinating book, Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, and that you visit Ben's website, bengoldfarb.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, nordenproductions.com. I would also like to invite you to share your comments and ideas, and even suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for Nature Revisited is Tim Buckley, Buzz and Fly. Nature Revisited is produced by Stefan Van Norden and Charles Gagan, and I hope you will join me for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, do remember, we are nature.